The light was fading as we drove through the winding roads on the way to the airport. A hush had settled over the landscape, the trees casting long shadows across the asphalt. I was half lost in my own thoughts when a deer bolted out from the forest and into the path of the car. The driver reacted instinctively, wrenching the wheel to the side. I remember a sharp jolt, the squeal of tires, and then nothing. The next thing I was aware of was a blinding whiteness, the sterile scent of disinfectant, the steady beeping of a monitor, and a dull, crushing ache throughout my body. I was lying in a hospital bed, confused and weightless, as though I was detached from my own flesh. A nurse appeared in my blurry vision. She leaned over gently, her voice soft. "You're in a military hospital in Frankfurt," she said. My head throbbed. My right leg and arm were immobilized, my ribs were burning, and every breath was a battle. Later, I'd learn I'd suffered a collapsed lung along with multiple fractures. But in that moment, I didn't even remember who I was. When the fog in my brain began to lift, I turned to the nurse and whispered, "How long have I been here?" 5 days, she replied, adjusting my IV. I hesitated, then asked, "Has my wife been here?" "No, sir," she said calmly. "Do you know where she is?" "She hasn't come," the nurse answered. "But we did notify her as soon as you were admitted. She's aware of your condition." My throat felt raw as I said, "Can I see my phone?" She brought me a bag of personal belongings. I fumbled through it until I found my phone and dialed Lydia's number with trembling fingers. She picked up almost immediately. Her voice cracked as she said, "Fred, are you okay?" I tried to sound stable. "Don't worry about me. Tell me about you. How are you? How's the baby?" Her reply came in sobs. "Fred, we lost her. The baby's gone. I'm so sorry." I felt the air sucked from my lungs. It was as though the hospital room collapsed in on itself. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even move. Eventually, I managed to get out. "Are you all right?" "I think so," Lydia said quietly. "I'm back home now. They don't want me to fly. Otherwise, I'd be with you." "What happened?" I asked, barely above a whisper. "No one really knows," she said. Everything was normal. Then I heard one of the nurses mutter, "Oh, God," and suddenly everyone was panicking. Later, they said something had gone wrong with the cord. I struggled to find words. "And you? You're sure you're okay?" She paused for a long time, then said, "Physically, yes, but inside? I feel shattered." "When will I see you again?" I asked. "I don't know yet," she answered. "They haven't given me clearance to travel." "Should I try to come to you?" "No," she insisted. "You need to rest. Please, Fred. Take care of yourself." 2 weeks later, after a long recovery and medical clearance, I was flown back to the States on a military medevac. Lydia met me at the airbase and accompanied me to Fort Hood Hospital. She looked thinner, haunted. Her voice had softened, and her eyes were red from tears that likely hadn't stopped flowing since that call. One afternoon, as we sat together in the hospital room, I asked her gently, "Did you give her a name?" Lydia nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, I named her Hope." And just like that, we both dissolved into tears. After another 2 weeks, I was released from the hospital under limited duty. No fieldwork, no drills, just paperwork and gradual physical therapy while my bones continued to heal. My body was slow to recover, but even slower was the healing between us. Still, we stayed close, clinging to each other the way shipwreck survivors cling to driftwood. Time moved on, the distance between us lessened. The pain faded from white-hot to a dull, lingering ache. I earned a promotion to major, and we were stationed in Heidelberg, Germany. We lived there for 3 years, traveling when we could, and finding moments of joy between the shadows. It was good. We made it good. Eventually, we received new orders and moved again, this time to Fort Lewis in Washington State. The accommodations were a step up. Field-grade officer housing with a real garage and space that finally felt like a home rather than temporary shelter. We started unpacking everything we'd sent from Germany, plus the boxes that had been in storage since before the move. Lydia went to a welcome gathering at the Officers Club that evening. She wanted to connect with other wives and regain a little normalcy. I stayed home to handle the mountain of unpacking. The house was filled with stacked cardboard towers, each one labeled and dated. While sorting through an older box, I came across a wooden chest I didn't remember seeing before. It was small, with polished edges and a delicate latch. Out of curiosity, I placed it on the table and opened it. Inside was a bundle of envelopes tied neatly with a pale pink ribbon. I removed the ribbon and opened the first envelope. It wasn't sealed. What I found inside made my blood run cold. It was an official birth certificate. The document stated that a baby girl had been born alive, 7 pounds, 6 ounces, 19 inches in length. The date matched the day Lydia had told me our daughter came into the world without a breath. The baby's name was listed as Hope. The mother was Lydia Jane Sadler, née Johnston. Under the section for the father's name, it simply read, unknown. At the bottom of the certificate were 2 tiny footprints pressed in ink. I collapsed into the nearest chair, staring blankly at the paper in my hands. My pulse thundered in my ears. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. After a while, I reached for the next envelope. It too was unsealed. Inside was a stack of legal documents, an adoption certificate. I read it, then reread it over and over, trying and failing to make sense of what I was seeing. It declared that a baby girl named Hope, born to Lydia Sadler, had been surrendered for adoption. All parental rights had been terminated. Because the father's identity was listed as unknown, his consent was deemed unnecessary. The terms were final. The location and identity of the adoptive family would remain sealed. No communication would ever be allowed. I kept going. Inside the rest of the envelopes were letters, dozens of them, all written by me. Letters I had sent to Lydia during deployments. She had saved everyone, tucked them away alongside these secrets. I stood frozen, struggling to breathe. My mind reeled. This hadn't been a decision made in a moment of panic. It was calculated, organized, signed, and sealed behind my back. If Lydia had already planned to give the baby away, what did that mean? Was she hiding something even deeper? And if I wasn't listed as the father, who was? Had she been unfaithful? How many others had there been? And how long had she been living this double life? I felt like I was suffocating. Eventually, I returned everything to the wooden chest and latched it shut. That's when I noticed what was scrawled on the outside of the box in black marker. Lydia's papers and childhood memories. If I'd seen that label earlier, I never would have opened it. Maybe I wasn't supposed to. Maybe every marriage, no matter how close, has doors that shouldn't be unlocked. I quietly slid the box back into its spot among the others, rearranged the surrounding stacks to hide any trace I'd touched it, and stepped outside into the cold. I sat on the back deck, the evening breeze brushing my face, trying to quiet the chaos inside me. The walls of the house felt too tight, the truth too loud. What now? How do I bring this up without tearing everything apart? How do you confront someone about a lie this massive? And more terrifyingly, what if she had reasons I couldn't understand? I couldn't turn to my parents. Not with this. They'd lose their minds. I was their only child, their entire legacy wrapped up in one person. They had waited years for a grandchild. I could already hear their outrage. And her parents? That wasn't an option either. We were never close with them, and they weren't the forgiving type. We didn't have close friends to fall back on either. The military lifestyle, with its constant relocations and disruptions, had made long-term relationships nearly impossible to maintain. I stayed out way past dark, just sitting on the damn curb, arms hanging off my knees like dead weight. Lydia rolled up finally, car lights cutting through the driveway like they owned the place. She parked, killed the engine, and came over and found me there, hunched and silent. "Hey, babe," she said, leaning down to kiss my cheek like nothing was off. "Get much unpacked today?" "Yeah, enough," I said, my voice sharp like a snapped wire. I didn't usually come at her like that. She felt it, stood there a second, eyes searching my face like she was waiting for more. I didn't give her crap. So she turned without a word and went inside. It was over an hour before I followed. When I finally stepped in, the first thing I noticed was the little wooden chest, her chest, gone. "We've been invited to some welcome wagon thing this Saturday," she said, trying to sound like she wasn't watching my every move. "That's fine," I muttered. "The Simpsons from Heidelberg are stationed here now. Do you remember them?" she asked, like I gave a damn. "Not really," I said, barely looking at her. "She played bridge with me. He was a G2 major, Jim and Fran," she added, pushing like it mattered. "Oh, yeah," I said. "I think I remember." She stepped closer, eyes locking on me now like she finally saw the storm I'd been dragging in with me. "Are you all right? Did something happen today? You're acting strange," she said, voice softer now, cautious. "Is something wrong?" I wanted to scream. "You have no freaking idea, and I swear I'm going to find out everything." But instead, I swallowed it and said, "No. Just a rough day. Feeling off, that's all." "You want anything for dinner? Or maybe we could go to the officers' club, she asked, like food could fix it. I'm not hungry, I said, already walking toward the bedroom. I think I'll lie down. I dropped face first onto the bed without even changing. At some point, I must have passed out. When I opened my eyes, it was already 1 a.m. I didn't get up until 9. That never happened. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. Eventually, I showered and made my way downstairs. She was already in the kitchen making coffee. Breakfast? She asked. No thanks, I said. Just coffee. She looked surprised. I always ate breakfast, always. She sat across from me at the table, watching me carefully. There's definitely something going on, she said softly. Please tell me. Maybe I can help. I've just got a lot on my mind, I muttered. I stood up, dumped the untouched coffee into the sink, and headed to the garage. I'm here if you need me, she called out as I left. I drove straight to the base golf course, parked, walked into the 19th hole cafe and ordered something I hadn't eaten in years. 2 eggs, corned beef hash, and a decaf coffee. It had once been my favorite breakfast, back before Lydia's preferences started dictating what came into the kitchen. Beef was a no-go for her, but I didn't care today. I needed to remember who I was before all of this. I ate most of it, then wandered out to the deck and watched the golfers wrap up the 18th hole. It was peaceful. It gave me space to think. When I got back home, the sun was high. Lydia had made significant progress with unpacking. The house looked more like a home. But as I glanced around, all I could picture was a little girl, a 5-year-old version of Hope, running through these rooms, laughing. The thought made me physically sick. I barely reached the bathroom in time before vomiting up everything I'd eaten. I was doubled over, gasping for breath, when I felt her hand on my back. Get off me, I snapped, just before throwing up again. It was the first time in years I'd thrown up without booze being involved. The last time was at my senior prom. When I was done, I went upstairs, rinsed my mouth, brushed my teeth. Lydia was in the living room holding a napkin to her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't stop. I walked past her and straight into the garage. As I backed the car out of the driveway, she appeared in my rearview mirror. I can't help you if you won't tell me what's wrong, she said, her voice hollow. I didn't stop. She stepped out of the way and let me go. I headed straight to my unit. The building was almost deserted except for the duty officer. I went to my desk and stared at paperwork I couldn't process. My mind kept spinning back to that box, that certificate, those footprints. I stayed there until after midnight. When I returned, the house was dark. Lydia was in bed, reading under the lamp. I walked right past her without saying a damn word, stripped down, and headed straight to the shower. I'll crash downstairs, I muttered, barely above a whisper, then stepped out and shut the door behind me. I flopped onto the couch, turned on the TV, just trying to drown everything out. Didn't even get through a minute before she came storming in, yanked the remote right out of my hand, and killed the screen. Enough, she said, standing in front of me like she was ready to go to war. You either let me the freak in or tell me to get out. But this cold shoulder crap? Nah, you don't get to tear me apart with your silence like I did something to deserve it. I didn't freaking do anything, and I'm not going to just stand here while you act like I'm the enemy. I stood up, didn't flinch, just took the remote right back out of her hand and turned the TV on again. Have a nice freaking trip, I said, ice cold. Less than an hour later, she was gone. She took her keys and left. We never fought like that. She had never threatened to walk away. And this time, she actually did. As soon as I was sure she was gone, I went straight to the basement. I dug through the storage stacks until I found the box. I opened it, retrieved the small wooden chest inside, pulled out the birth certificate and adoption papers, and made copies. Then I carefully placed everything back exactly as I found it. That night, I slept in our bed, alone. On Monday morning, I went to my commanding officer's office and told him everything. I laid out the situation, the documents, the questions I couldn't ignore. He looked stunned. I've only had you under my command for a month, he said. What are you planning to do? I don't know yet, I admitted. She didn't say where she was going, but she didn't take everything. She left that box. I paused. I think I want to try to find my daughter. If she's really mine, that's where I need to start. You do realize that won't be easy, he said. Adoption records are sealed, strictly confidential. I understand, but I can't rely on her to tell me the truth anymore. I need to find out for myself. Then, suddenly, it hit me. Oh, wait, hold on. I think I have an idea, I said. Can I take the day off? He nodded. Granted. I saluted, bolted out of his office, ran down the steps, and jumped into my car. I had no clear plan, just a sudden, urgent hope burning in my chest. I lifted the lid of the storage box and retrieved the small wooden container from within. My hands trembled as I pried it open, tipping its contents onto the hardwood floor. Only one item fell out. A single, slightly discolored pacifier. It was small, worn, and faintly scratched. I stared at it for a long moment, imagining it once nestled in Hope's mouth, imagining she might have used it in the brief time before she was taken away. I carefully sealed the pacifier inside a clear zip bag, then went online and started hunting for a DNA testing facility nearby. I found one in downtown Seattle with good reviews and quick turnaround options. I walked to the bathroom next, searching for any remnants of Lydia's belongings. The shelves were bare. Everything of hers was gone. Lotions, creams, hair ties, even the toothbrush. I dug around beneath the sink and eventually uncovered an old brush stuffed in the back of a drawer. I could see a few long strands of her hair tangled in the bristles. I sealed it in another bag. Not wasting another minute, I grabbed both samples, jumped in the car, and headed to the city. When I arrived at the lab, I was greeted by a technician named Margie. I handed her the pacifier first. She turned it over in her gloved hands. "And this might be difficult," she said, examining it closely. "Depending on how long it's been stored, we might not be able to extract viable DNA, but we'll try." Then she opened the second bag and pulled a few hairs from the brush. "This should be no problem," she said confidently. Finally, she handed me a small plastic vial. "Spit into this for your control sample." I followed her instructions, and when I was finished, she sealed the samples in individual envelopes and labeled each one carefully. "We'll contact you in about 3 weeks with the results," she said. I rolled back into Fort Lewis late that night. Lydia didn't bother calling until the next day. "Hey," I said when I picked up. "You feeling any better?" "Better than what?" she snapped, her voice cold as crap. "Better than the a-hole you turned into 2 days ago?" "Nope," I said, flat as a brick wall. "Still that same prick." "So, still not safe for me to come home?" she said, her voice thick with sarcasm. "No, definitely not. Maybe try again in 3 weeks." "Why the hell 3 weeks?" "'Cause by then I'll know whether I'm gonna eliminate you or just divorce your A." I hung up. No hesitation. She called back 2 seconds later. I let it ring. Didn't pick up. Next day, I pulled into the driveway, and there she was, already waiting, fuming like a damn volcano. Soon as I stepped out the car, she charged up. "What the hell was that crap you said about eliminating me or divorcing me?" she shouted. "Exactly what it sounded like," I said, standing tall, dead calm. "I think I deserve an explanation," she barked. "And I think I deserve one too," I fired back. "About what?" she shot back, confused and pissed. We weren't screaming, but the tension between us could have snapped steel. The air was thick, heavy with all the crap we weren't saying. "You really think you don't owe me nothing?" I asked, eyes locked on hers. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," she said, brows furrowed. "What the hell is this even about?" "So there's no hope, huh?" I said, dragging that name out like a damn blade. Her whole face cracked. Like in one blink, she wasn't pissed anymore. She was wrecked. Eyes wide, body froze. "Oh no," she whispered. "Please, no." "I'm leaving for an hour," I said, walking past her like she was already a ghost. "When I get back, I want you gone. I leave for work at 6:30 tomorrow. I'll be home by 5. By then, every last thing of yours better be out of this house." I drove off and returned exactly an hour later. She was gone, along with the small wooden box and a good portion of her belongings. She tried to call that night, probably several times, but I blocked her number after the first attempt. I needed silence. At 6:30 the next morning, I started the car, garage door opening slowly. In the rearview mirror, there she was again, standing behind the vehicle. I backed out, inch by inch. She walked with the car, hands pressed against the trunk. "Can we just talk, please?" she begged, voice shaking. I didn't respond. I didn't even look at her. Suddenly, 3 men, neighbors maybe, or friends she'd called, jumped out of a nearby van and pulled her away from the vehicle. I wasn't sure whether to feel thankful or furious. That evening, the house was nearly stripped. She'd taken almost everything: furniture, decorations, curtains. She even took the good china and silverware I never cared about. What she left behind were the things I actually used: my recliner, the guest bed, the cookware. She had made her departure as surgical as it was personal. The next morning, I called my office to say I'd be arriving late. Then I contacted Post Housing to request temporary government furnishings. I made the necessary rounds, called the credit union, the insurance office, my stockbroker, started laying the foundation for what I already knew was coming: divorce. I scheduled a consultation with the JAG office on base. Military attorneys can't represent you in civilian divorce court, but they can offer advice. The officer confirmed what I feared. She'll likely walk away with half, he said. Even though you don't own the home, the assets between you, including your cars, are marital property. Both cars had been purchased overseas during our time in Germany. We'd saved thousands that way, and now I'd be losing half of it. Later that day, my commanding officer pulled me aside. "Whatever time you need, it's yours," he said quietly. "Just keep me posted." For the next couple of weeks, I drifted through the days like a man half awake. I did my duties, kept up appearances, trimmed the yard, cleaned the garage, but nothing felt real. Then one morning, the phone rang. "Hello? Is this Major Fred Sadler?" a woman asked. "Yes." "This is Margie from the DNA Center. You dropped off some samples with us a few weeks ago." "Yes, I remember." "Well, your results are in. You can come by to review them." "Can't you tell me over the phone?" "I'm sorry, sir. We need to confirm your ID in person, or we can mail the results to the address you provided." "I'll come in." I drove straight to the lab and asked for Margie. She came out, smiled politely, and extended her hand. "May I see your identification?" I handed over my military ID. "Follow me." She led me to a small, windowless room. A few minutes later, she returned with a sealed envelope and the pacifier in a bag. She laid everything on the table. "Sample A is your DNA," she explained. "Sample B is the hair you provided. Sample C is from the pacifier." I nodded, bracing myself. "Samples B and C show a biological relationship," she said. "Sample A shows no relation to either." I thanked her, took the paperwork and the pacifier, and walked out. I sat in my car for a long time, processing. So the child was real, and she belonged to Lydia. But she didn't belong to me. Some other man had a daughter calling him daddy, not me. I contacted the JAG office again. They couldn't directly represent me, but they gave me a vetted list of civilian attorneys. I called every name, set up 6 appointments. The third one stuck. He was a former JAG himself. No patience for cheaters, didn't matter their gender. He spoke with clarity, certainty, and steel in his voice. He was exactly what I needed. I spent well over an hour laying everything out, start to finish, for the lawyer. He never interrupted, never looked at his watch. He just listened, eyes sharp, expression growing darker with every detail. When I finally stopped talking, he leaned back and exhaled through his nose. "In 45 years of practicing law," he said, voice low and grim, "I've never heard something so cold-blooded. This isn't just dishonesty, it's deliberate cruelty, wrapped in calculation. She's not just heartless, it's like she was born without a conscience. Unfortunately," he added, "family court rarely works in favor of the man. Doesn't matter how innocent he is. It's as if the system needs to break him in order to feel just." That night, when I got home, I found an envelope waiting in the mailbox. No postage, no fluff, just a handwritten note. "Fred, 3 weeks are up. Lydia." It was cold, clinical. The return address, her parents' house in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. I dialed her number. "Hi, Fred," she answered like we were picking up from a casual chat. "I'm not doing this over the phone," I said flatly. "And I'm not getting on a plane to Pennsylvania either." "Then I guess you will have to come here." "I am here. I mailed that letter from Seattle last week." There was a pause. "I'll be at the house at 6:30, I told her. "Show up then." She didn't say another word, just hung up. I didn't set the table. I didn't uncork a bottle of wine or prepare a single snack. This wasn't a reunion. It was a reckoning. On the dull military-issued coffee table, I laid out 3 documents: the DNA results, the birth certificate, and the adoption papers. She pulled into the driveway at 6:20, but didn't ring the bell until the clock struck exactly 6:30, right on schedule, as if punctuality could undo what had already been done. I let her in without a word, motioned toward the chair across from me, and sat down on the couch. She chose the stiffer, less comfortable wooden chair, appropriate for the tension in the room. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the pacifier, and held it toward her. Her face cracked like glass under pressure. She took the pacifier from my hand with shaky fingers and clutched it to her chest like it was some holy damn relic. "Thank you," she whispered, barely getting the words out. Then I handed her the DNA results. You already freaking know what it says, I told her. But here's the proof, just so we're clear. She gave a small nod, slow, like her whole body was starting to shut down. Her left hand reached for the envelope, still clutching that damn pacifier in the other. I'm guessing you're sample A? She asked, voice low and brittle. That's right, I said without flinching. I slid the rest of the paperwork across the table. Clean, brutal, final. She leaned in, read the title on top of the stack. The calm she'd been faking started to crack wide open. Her eyes welled up, lips trembling. She set the DNA sheet aside, hands moving to the divorce papers. As she tried to read, the tears made the ink run. Her fingers shook as she fumbled in her pocket. Do you have a tissue? She asked, like we were still playing polite. I don't, I said, cold as hell. That was a lie. Box was sitting right there on the nightstand. She looked at it, then looked at me. She knew. I didn't move a freaking inch. You're really not going to make this easy, huh? She said, barely holding it together. You cheated, I said. No emotion, just fact. She gave a small nod. No denial, just guilt hanging in the air like smoke. How many times? I asked. Does it even matter? She replied, voice cracked. No, I said, but I still want to freaking know. One weekend, 2 guys. It only happened once, she said, eyes stuck on the table like if she didn't look at me, it wouldn't hit as hard. Who was it? I asked. She stared at the wood grain like it could save her. Does it really change anything? She mumbled. I think I deserve to freaking know, I said. I'm not telling you, she said, quietly but firm. Do I know him? I asked again, jaw tight. I'm not telling you that either, she said, eyes still glued to anything but me. So you'd rather protect him than take one last freaking shot at fixing this marriage? I fired back. She let out a sigh, defeated, tired, done, and looked down at the divorce papers. There's nothing left to fix, she said. Not anymore. Telling you his name won't fix a damn thing. It'll just make you angrier. Then explain the real betrayal, I said, voice low but lethal. Why the hell'd you lie about our daughter? Why'd you tell me she was just arrived and was gone? She sat there quiet, like the weight of it was finally sitting on her chest. Yeah, she said slowly. You deserve that answer. She stood, walked over to the shelf, grabbed the tissue box I'd ignored, and set it down in front of her. She took one, wiped her face, still holding the pacifier in her other hand like it was the last piece of her soul. When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked, she began. I didn't know whose baby it was, yours or his. I considered terminating the pregnancy, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I kept telling myself it might be yours, and when the ultrasound showed it was a girl, I started believing the lie I needed to believe. She paused, breathing unevenly. I thought, maybe there's no way to tell. Maybe she'll look like me. Maybe she'll look like you. You'd never know, right? That's what I told myself. That there's a special bond between dads and daughters, and you'd love her either way. Her voice broke. But the closer we got to her due date, the more terrified I became. What if you saw her and just knew? Then you got deployed, and I was relieved. I thought, okay, this buys me time. But then you said you were flying back for the birth, and that piece shattered. I was in full panic mode again. What if you saw her? And everything fell apart. She wiped her eyes again and continued. When she was born, they laid her on my chest. She was perfect. She had soft blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. I knew the second I looked at her. She wasn't yours. Her voice fell to a whisper. But she was mine, and I loved her. God, I loved her. But I loved you too. And I had to choose. She looked down at the pacifier. I chose you. She let that sit in the air for a moment, like a confession she'd been holding in for years. I told the hospital I wanted to place her for adoption. They didn't waste time. Within a day, the paperwork was in my hands. When they asked about the father, I said I didn't know. They told me that would simplify things. No consent required. Her voice cracked again. She was nursing when they brought in the documents. I signed everything. And when I reached out to hold her one last time, the nurse said, I'm sorry, she's no longer yours. Tears streamed down her face now. Her shoulders curled in. I reached anyway. I managed to grab the pacifier. That's all I left with. That, and 2 pictures on my phone. That's all I have. She broke completely, sobbing as the weight of everything poured out. God forgive me, she choked out. I want my daughter back. I sat across from her, heart numb, unable to say a word. Her pain was real. Her shame was real, but so was the betrayal. After a while, I walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and brought it back to her. She took it with shaky hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Eventually, she quieted. Her sobs softened into sniffles, her curled frame on the couch now motionless beneath the blanket I'd draped over her. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice hoarse. "I knew I couldn't hide it forever," she whispered. "So I told you the baby was a case of fetal demise. Said she was cremated. That was easier than telling the truth." She glanced up, eyes glassy. "When you got home and didn't ask to see any paperwork, no birth certificate, no pass-away record, I was surprised. Part of me expected you to demand answers." "I didn't think I had to," I replied. "I trusted you. You were my wife." She gave a faint nod, more shame than agreement. "And you were hurting, too. You'd just been through hell. I figured you didn't want to dig deeper. And life. Eventually, it found a rhythm again. Things felt almost normal, on the surface at least, but something was always missing. And over time, that emptiness grew louder. Her eyes drifted to the pacifier sitting on the table. Every year, on her birthday, I'd pull out the birth certificate and hold that pacifier. I'd trace her little footprints with my finger, just to feel like she was still part of me. I even thought about putting the pacifier in my mouth, just to feel her. It still had a bit of dried bosom milk on it. I couldn't bear to lose that. She looked away suddenly, staring at nothing. "But now, it's gone," she said, her voice rising with panic. "They must have scraped it off during the DNA test." Her eyes locked on mine, wild and hollow. "Oh my God," she gasped. "It's gone." She stared at me like I had stolen something sacred. "You took her milk," she hissed. "That was hers. You took the last thing I had left." She crumpled to the floor, collapsing into herself, her cries violent and raw. I stood there for a moment, stunned, unsure what to do. Then I bent down, gently lifted her, and carried her back to the couch. I covered her again and left the room. I couldn't bear to watch her unravel. But I couldn't just leave her like that either. So I retreated to my bedroom. I didn't sleep. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. At some point, I heard the bathroom door open, then the soft sound of the toilet flushing. I walked downstairs. She was sitting upright on the couch, wrapped in the blanket, eyes red but calm. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked quietly. She nodded. "Yes, please." She followed me into the kitchen and took a seat at the counter while I brewed the pot. When it was ready, I handed her a mug. She took a sip and gave me a weak smile. "I guess I kind of panicked, didn't I?" "You could say that," I replied. We sat in silence for a while. "Want a refill?" I asked. "Yes, thank you." I poured another cup. "Where are you staying?" "A motel just off post," she said. "You've been there the whole 3 weeks?" "No, I spent most of the time with my parents. They paid for the trip." "Do they know what actually happened?" She shook her head. "No." I lied. Told them we were having a rough patch, that I needed space. "They think I came back to try to make things right." She didn't say anything else. Instead, she stood up, walked to the coffee table, pulled a pen from her purse, sat back down, and without a word, signed the divorce papers. She didn't even glance at the terms. Then she picked up her things and walked out. I stood there for a few moments before quietly gathering the coffee cups. I cleaned up and went to bed. When I woke up, it was late Sunday morning. The house was silent. I spent the day alone, letting my thoughts run until they finally began to slow. On Monday, I took the signed papers to my attorney, and they were officially filed. I also went to the housing authority and told them I wanted to move off post. I needed distance from everything. 6 months passed. The divorce was finalized. Lydia never showed up in court. She didn't file a response, didn't contest anything. She walked away with only her car and whatever she'd taken when she left the house. A copy of the final judgment was mailed to her parents' address in Pennsylvania. I never heard back. I tried not to think about her, but one question haunted me like a ghost I couldn't banish. Who was the man she had cheated with? She never told me his name, never explained how it happened or why. What hurt the most wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the pregnancy. It was the secrecy, the fact that she protected him, that she chose silence over honesty. Just one weekend, she had said, but that weekend had shattered everything. Thankfully, work became my anchor. The pace was relentless, and I leaned into it. No time to dwell, no room for bitterness to take root. I didn't date, I didn't socialize, I just functioned. The only time I felt human again was once a week, when I joined Major George Johnson and his family for dinner. They were everything a military family aspired to be: warm, structured, supportive, husband, wife, 2 kids, 2 working cars, a kitchen that smelled like home. Sure, they moved often like the rest of us, always packing and unpacking, enrolling the kids in new schools every year. It wasn't easy, but they made it work. George and Marion had been married for 12 years. Their son was 10, their daughter 8. I didn't know what normal looked like, but they seemed close enough. One evening after dinner, George and I stayed up talking. The conversation drifted toward TDYs, temporary duty assignments. We talked about how much they pulled us from our families, how, after a while, they stopped feeling like travel and started feeling like avoidance. He mentioned he'd been selected for a 2-week security seminar at Fort Hood. The next morning, I went straight to our commanding officer. "Sir," I said, "is there any reason I can't attend the seminar in place of Major Johnson?" "Not really," he said. "The general thought he had a bit more field time than you, but if you're interested, we can swap it." "I am," I said. "It's their anniversary. Let them spend it together." The CO laughed. "Didn't know you had a romantic streak, Major Sadler." 2 weeks later, I was back at Fort Hood, the very place where Lydia had given birth to her daughter. It felt strange being back, like walking across old wounds. But the seminar was easygoing. We were split into teams for a collaborative project, 18 officers. When the groups were formed, 2 of us were left unassigned. That's how I met Major Keith Franklin. He was stationed at Fort Wainwright in Alaska, the coldest base in the Army. But he didn't mind the cold, said it gave him focus. He was brilliant, especially with tech. We meshed instantly, outperformed every other group without even trying. We had to slow down just to let the others keep up. That Friday, we grabbed lunch at the Officers Club. Somewhere between the burgers and the coffee, Keith opened up. "I cheated on my wife," he said suddenly. "She left me, took the kids. Now she's with some civilian and they call him Dad." The words landed heavy. I knew that pain, that exact pain. And suddenly I didn't feel quite so alone. As lunch wrapped up, I finally shared my story with Keith. Everything from the lies to the DNA tests, the unanswered questions, and the nagging need for closure. When I finished, he just stared at me in disbelief. "And you still don't know who the guy was?" Keith asked, leaning forward. "No," I replied. "She never told me, not a name, not a hint." "This all went down here at Hood?" he said. "Yeah," I nodded. 5, maybe 6 years back. All I know is he had blonde hair and blue eyes. That's literally it. Keith stood up abruptly. "Come on," he said. "We're going for a drive." He took us straight to the Manpower Center. It's where every single person, military or civilian, connected to Fort Hood eventually passes through. Once inside, he led me directly to an office at the back. The nameplate on the door read, "Mrs. Lucy Healy." Before I could ask anything, the door opened. A woman in her 60s stepped out with a warm smile and wrapped Keith in a hug. "Keith, my boy," she said cheerfully. "Aunt Lucy," Keith said, grinning as he pulled back. "I want you to meet someone. Major Fred Sadler." She turned to me, her handshake warm and firm. "Fred, so glad to meet you," she said. "Nice to meet you too," I replied, noticing her calm, sharp energy. "I'm Aunt Lucy to everyone," she added with a wink. "Makes life simpler." Keith wasted no time. "Aunt Lucy, we're trying to track down someone who might have been stationed here about 6 years ago. Blonde hair, blue eyes, male, possibly military." She raised an eyebrow. "That's it?" she asked, a touch of humor in her voice. "No name? No rank? No department?" "Afraid not," Keith said. She looked at me curious. "Fred Sadler. You were here, right, with your wife?" I nodded. "Yes, we were stationed here together." Keith glanced at me and added, "What I haven't mentioned, Aunt Lucy has HSAM." I looked between them. "You mean highly superior autobiographical memory?" "That's right," Keith said. "It's a state of being," Lucy added, her tone both matter-of-fact and wry. "Or a curse, depending on the day," Keith joked. "Very few people have it," he continued. "But Aunt Lucy's like the living memory bank of Fort Hood, especially when it comes to personnel." I turned to her. "So, you remember everything?" She nodded. "Everything that's ever happened to me personally. Faces, files, voices, word. It all stays," I exhaled. "That's incredible. How do you make room for all that?" "No one knows," she replied. "But the hard part isn't remembering. It's not forgetting. I remember every joyful moment and every heartbreak. That part can drag you under, if you let it." I can imagine, I said quietly. Keith jumped back in. Fred's looking for someone who might have been involved with his wife back then, but all he's got is the blonde hair and blue eyes. Lucy let out a laugh. No height, no build, not even a vague description of duty? Nothing, I admitted. Sorry. She shook her head, amused. That's barely enough to work with. I've met hundreds, maybe thousands of guys with that look. But give me some time. I'll check with a few people. Maybe something clicks. I hesitated. Do you think it even matters now? Lucy looked at me seriously. If it's still haunting you, Fred, then yeah, it matters. Keith gave me a subtle nod, then said to Lucy, We appreciate anything you can find. She reached into her drawer and scribbled something. Let me take both your numbers. I'll call if anything comes to mind. 2 days later, Keith's phone buzzed. He answered and put the call on speaker. Keith? Lucy's voice came through. I've been thinking about that man you asked about. Any luck? Keith asked. Well, Lucy said, I don't recall any soldiers or officers with blonde hair and blue eyes that would have matched the right age or timing. But there are 2 civilians I know of who worked with the post engineer's office. One's been around since the early 90s. Too old, I think. The other's been here about 10 years. He used to oversee the plumbing division, but now he's in charge of construction projects. Name? Keith asked. Kurt Weber, Lucy replied. Blue eyes, blonde hair, late 30s now, I guess. He fits the profile more than anyone else. There are other guys with that look on post, but none that seem like a match. And I didn't try recalling anyone living off base, figured Fred wouldn't have had time to get close to many civilians. Thanks, Aunt Lucy, Keith said. Anytime, sweetheart, she replied, then ended the call. Keith turned to me. You want to check him out? I nodded slowly. Yeah, I need to know. I need to see. Keith, already anticipating it, picked up the phone again. Let's get his address. He called Lucy back. Any chance we can get Weber's contact info? Of course, she said. Got the civilian directory right here. Moments later, she read it off. Keith laughed. You're the best, Aunt Lucy. I owe you dinner. By 3:45 that afternoon, we were sitting in his rental car outside the post engineer's building, waiting. We didn't have to wait long. A tall, clean-cut man emerged from the building. Broad shoulders, confident stride, tan complexion, perfect blonde hair. He looked exactly like the kind of guy you instinctively didn't trust. There he is, Keith muttered. We tailed him at a distance, careful not to get too close. He drove straight home. An upscale residential neighborhood, nothing flashy. We parked half a block away, just close enough to watch. He didn't leave again, but his wife, or who we assumed was his wife, was outside tending to the garden. 3 kids with matching blonde hair played on the lawn. Keith turned to me. You sure you want to go through with this? You don't need to stay, I said quietly. He shook his head with a grin. Are you kidding? This is great. I'm sitting here thinking up ways to make this guy sweat. I smiled faintly. I've got a few ideas myself. We watched, silent for a moment, both lost in thought. For the first time in years, I felt like I might finally be standing at the edge of the truth. And I was ready, whatever it cost, to look it in the face. The following morning, I pulled my car to a stop on a quiet street parallel to Kurt Weber's neighborhood. I had one goal, wait him out. Maybe he was going golfing, maybe running weekend errands. Either way, I was prepared to sit there all day if I had to. Almost 2 hours in, his garage door finally creaked open and his silver SUV rolled out onto the driveway. Finally, I thought. I wasn't exactly thrilled about spending my Sunday on a stakeout, but I would have waited until nightfall if that's what it took. He drove to a nearby Home Depot. I followed at a safe distance, parked a few rows behind him, and trailed him inside. It was obvious he was a regular. He nodded at employees, greeted them by name, even joked with one of the clerks near the entrance. He poured himself a cup of free contractor coffee from a dispenser near the door and chatted casually with a salesman about tiling options. Then, I noticed something stupid, but it stuck with me. The guy chewed gum like a cow. Loud, open-mouthed, obnoxious. The kind of trait that makes someone instantly unlikable, even if you don't already hate them for sleeping with your wife. When the salesman was called away, Weber drained the last of his coffee, spit his used gum into the paper cup, popped in a fresh stick, and wandered toward the lumber section. I scanned the area. No one was paying attention. I slipped over to the trash can, peeked inside, and there it was. His discarded coffee cup sitting right on top, the gum still inside. I grabbed it with a plastic bag I'd brought, sealed it, and headed back to my car. As I drove off, I called Keith. "I've got something," I told him. He chuckled. "Good, because I've got something even better. Get over here." When I returned to the BOQ, Keith looked like a kid on Christmas morning. He waved a stack of documents at me. "You're going to want to sit down for this," he said. I dropped into the chair. He handed me the papers. "What am I looking at?" I asked. He pointed at the top sheet. "That's her name, her new name. Hopes." I stared at the page. "Sarah Randolph?" I asked, my voice catching. Keith grinned. "Her adoptive family, full address, medical records, all of it." My jaw dropped. "How the hell did you get this?" "I didn't," he said. "My brother did. Well, let's say he has certain skills. The adoption agency's files were locked tighter than a Pentagon server." "And he cracked it?" "Yep," Keith said. "Military-grade encryption. Didn't even slow him down." I laughed, overwhelmed. "That's amazing, but now what?" Keith leaned back. "Not sure, but we've got the truth. That's a hell of a start." "Right," I said, shaking my head. "Now we just need to avoid headlines like Army officers expose identity of minor for vengeance." Keith rolled his eyes and dropped the papers on the coffee table. "Okay, point taken. No blackmail." I gathered the documents and the coffee cup and returned to my quarters. I placed them carefully on my desk. For reasons I still can't explain, I opened a browser and entered the Randolph's address into the GPS. Corsicana, Texas, roughly 200 miles away. The next morning, I hit the road at sunrise. It was a standard suburban neighborhood. Neat lawns, picket fences, weekend BBQ, smoke in the air. I parked down the street and waited. The hours passed slowly. Kids played outside. A few men mowed their lawns. Families came and went. Finally, around noon, a silver sedan pulled into the Randolph's driveway. A man behind the wheel, a woman in the passenger seat, and a little girl in the back. The woman stepped out, opened the rear door, and unbuckled the child. I grabbed my phone. She helped the girl out, smoothed her dress, and fixed a barrette in her blonde hair. I snapped a few quick photos from the car. Just then, a sound startled me. A woman and her child were walking nearby. The child spotted the girl by the car and squealed, "Sarah!" Sarah turned and ran to her friend. They embraced, giggling, just feet from where I sat. I took a few more photos and drove off before anyone noticed. A few blocks away, I pulled over and checked the pictures. 4 of them were perfect. Her blue eyes were crystal clear. I drove back to Fort Hood a few days later. Keith and I coasted through the rest of the training course. We graduated on Friday, had drinks that night, and flew out Saturday. He to Alaska, me back to Seattle. Monday was a school holiday, so I had the day off. I headed to the lab with the original DNA report and the coffee cup containing Weber's gum. When I walked in, the technician, Margie, didn't recognize me at first, until I mentioned the pacifier. "Oh, that was you?" she said, surprised. I handed her the new items. "I'll be back in 3 weeks," I said, but it didn't take that long. 2 weeks later, she called. "It's a match," she said. "They're a biological trio. Mother, father, child. We'll send the full results by mail." That was it. Confirmation. Weber was the father. Lydia had cheated with him, and Hope, Sarah, was their child. I didn't know how to process it. I sat with it for days, not sure what to do. Then the idea came to me. I bought a basic stationery kit from Walmart. Plain envelopes, blank paper. I wore gloves, removed all identifying info from the DNA report, and made copies of the best 2 photos of Sarah. I wiped everything clean. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trace of me. I sealed the documents and the pictures in one envelope and addressed it to Mrs. Kurt Weber. I included Lydia's name and her parents' address too, just in case someone needed to connect the dots. Then I drove to the Central Post Office in Seattle and dropped it in the mailbox. Done. I had no clue what would happen once that envelope landed in Killeen, Texas. I could only hope she'd be the one to find it. What I wanted, deep down, was simple. I wanted her to destroy him. I wanted his world to crumble. I wanted his wife to scream, rip, tear, and make him pay. As for their kids, I pitied them. But him, I wished him hell. A month later, my phone rang. The caller ID lit up with a name I hadn't expected. Aunt Lucy. Her voice was sharp. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I expect the truth." I'll do my best, I replied cautiously. Don't dance around it. I want honesty. Did you and Keith send something to Kurt Weber's wife, or do something that triggered a divorce? I paused, then said, look, Keith wasn't involved. Not at all. Whatever happened, it was me. I gave her most of the truth, carefully sidestepping any mention of Keith. If there were going to be consequences, I wanted them to fall on me alone. He didn't need to be dragged into it. Well, Aunt Lucy said with a sigh, you sure kicked over a hornet's nest. Her tone wasn't angry, more amused than anything, like she'd seen worse. Turns out when Mrs. Weber got that envelope, she wasn't even sure whose DNA she was looking at, yours, her husband's, someone else's, so she didn't take any chances. She collected her husband's DNA herself, ran the test again, sent in profiles for him, the woman, and the child. She paused, then delivered the blow. They matched. I didn't respond. There wasn't much to say. That's when everything unraveled, she added quietly. Then softer now, almost reluctant, she asked, do you know who the woman was? The one he had the affair with? I answered without hesitation. Yeah, she was my wife, Aunt Lucy. There was a sharp inhale on the other end of the line. Oh, Lord, she murmured. I had a feeling, but I was hoping I was wrong. She took another breath, then continued. Well, you'll be interested to know he was called into the office yesterday. And let's just say he didn't take it well. He's been fuming, ranting, stomping around base like the world betrayed him. Good, I said plainly. If hearing that his marriage is in flames is the worst part of his week, that's still the best news I've had in months. I only feel bad for his wife and kids. They didn't deserve that fallout. For me, it was already done. Lydia and I were over. The ink on the divorce papers had dried. Now it was Weber's turn to face the consequences of his choices. I took the folder Keith had given me, all the documents, reports, and information, and placed it inside a box with a handful of other things I didn't have the heart to trash but couldn't keep in plain sight either. It was time to move forward. My past wasn't going to disappear, but it no longer had the power to hold me in place.